It took a special kind of courage to be an early aviation pioneer. I mean, certainly it was dangerous to try to fly up in the air in a contraption that you probably built in your garage, but also it wasn't exactly an accepted avocation. Many people thought that the idea was downright crazy. Some even thought it heretical, believing that God never intended for man to fly. And so you didn't just risk life and limb with your machine, you also risked being ostracized and derided by your neighbors. Richard William Pearse of New Zealand was one of those early aviation pioneers whose neighbors viewed him with derision. They dismissively called him Bamboo Dick, referring to the bamboo that he used as the frame for his contraptions, or sometimes just Mad Pearse. And he died alone in a sanitarium in obscurity, but he may well have been the first man to fly an airplane driven by an engine. And controversial claims to historical first aside, he certainly represented a genius and a spirit that deserves to be remembered. He was born in December 1877 in Temeka, New Zealand. Diggory Pearse, his father, was a Cornish immigrant who worked as a cattle farmer. Richard was the fourth of 9 children in the family. They lived in a remote corner of the world and had to entertain themselves. Historians say the family created its own orchestra, with Richard playing the cello. They also created a tennis court to challenge each other to games. As a child, Pearse was described as a dreamer who showed promise as an inventor. Pearse's earliest inventions were geared towards improving the family's farm equipment, using a forge that he had created himself, built out of scrap metal. He might have made an excellent engineer, but his family didn't have the means to send him to a university, so his raw talent remained unrefined. Curiously similar to the Wright brothers, he tinkered with bicycles before turning his attention to flying machines. He invented a bicycle of his own design that used a bamboo frame that had vertical crank gears and self-inflating tires. In a later interview, Pearse says he shifted his attention to flying after a worldwide aviation challenge was issued. He said, "I did not attempt anything practical with the idea until in 1904, the St. Louis Exposition authorities offered a prize of $20,000 to the man who invented and flew a flying machine over a specific course. I did not, as you know, succeed in winning the prize. Neither did anybody." But eyewitnesses to Pearse's flying experiments say he was attempting flight earlier than 1904. In March 1902 or 1903, multiple witnesses saw Pearse crash into a 12-foot-high hedge on his property, but they couldn't agree on the year. Someone claimed he had taken a photo of Pearse's wreck in the hedge, but the photo's been lost. Unfortunately, the hospital where Pearse was treated for his flight injuries burned, and there are no records to corroborate the date. Historian and biographer George Ogilvy believes the flight took place in March 1903. To make his flight into the hedge possible, Pearse had created an engine from farm equipment for his flying machine sometimes prior to that. Remains of one of Pearse's engines, which was rediscovered in a garbage dump in 1963, shows that he made his 2 horizontally opposed cylinders from cast iron drain pipes. Pearse later claimed his engine was the most efficient lightweight engine that had been invented at the time, as it was capable of producing 1 horsepower for every 5 pounds of engine. Estimates based on the design suggest it was capable of about 15 horsepower, roughly comparable or even a little bit better than the engine used in the 1903 Wright Flyer. His aviation innovations were all the more impressive because of the fact that he was inventing in a near vacuum. He was so far removed from civilization that he couldn't follow the latest trends in aviation technology. He couldn't leverage the ideas of industrial centers that were manufacturing motor cars. And unlike the Wright brothers, he didn't even have a partner off whom he could bounce ideas. In fact, he largely invented in private due to the attitudes of his neighbors hiding in his garage. Many of them thought that he was being a heretic. If God had intended for men to fly, they argued, then we would have been born with wings. They mocked Pearse's distinctive bushy hair, laughed at his airplanes made out of bamboo, canvas, and wire. In an area where farming was key and airplanes were just fantasy, the inventor's farm often suffered from his distractions. But the man they called Bamboo Dick didn't let his neighbors' attitudes deter him. He worked out of sight of their prying eyes in his barn until he was ready to test his machines. Pearse mounted his bamboo frame on tricycle wheels and sat in the center of it with the engine above his head. Created simple, small ailerons for the wings. He is said to have been the first inventor to do so. The tricycle wheels, which included a steerable nose wheel, acted as a sort of landing gear, another first, as the Wright's early planes used skids. Remarkably, the propeller had variable pitch blades, was tied directly to the crankshaft rather than requiring belts and a transmission as the Wright's plane did. Overall, Pearse's plane was said to resemble a modern monoplane rather than a biplane. Instead of the Wright brothers' method of wing warping, Pearse developed a system of flaps and ailerons that did not require twisting the wing, the system used by virtually all aircraft today. The placement of his controls for pitch and yaw, however, made them likely insufficient for controlled flight. Sadly, there are no newspaper reports of Pearse's exploits. Even he seemed unconcerned with the little attention he received. He wrote to a newspaper in 1915, "The honor of inventing the aeroplane is the product of many minds. Preeminence will undoubtedly be given to the Wright brothers, as they were actually the first to make successful flights with a motor-driven airplane." Pearse was dismissive of his early efforts and said his first flights were too bumpy and out of control to really count. He moved to the town of Milton in 1911 and may have dumped many of his experiments at the time because the ground near his new home was too hilly for his flying machines. He moved again to Christchurch and continued with his inventions, both flight-related and otherwise. While he continued tinkering and eventually innovated new fixes for his plane, but then aviation was developing rapidly internationally, and he saw little point in continuing. In addition to inventing a potato planting machine and a device that could record sound, towards the end of his life, Pearse seemed to have been working on a flying car. Roughly described as a cross between a windmill and a rubbish cart, Pearse's tilt-rotor machine had a tail and wings that could fold up into a storage compartment. The idea of creating a vehicle that could as easily drive down the road or take off into the air, an idea that is yet to be perfected today. His hope was to create a machine that would make flying as available to the common person as Henry Ford's Model T had made automobiles. Towards the end of his life, Pearse suffered from paranoia and delusions that someone like a spy from a foreign country was going to come and steal his inventions. He spent the last year of his life in Sunnyside Mental Hospital and died age 75 in July 1953. Pearse's work likely would have been forgotten, except that the trustee assigned to Pearse's estate was going through the papers Pearse left behind and recognized the brilliance of the late inventor's designs. He brought them to the attention of George Bolt, another of New Zealand's early aviators. Bolt went to the garbage dump and unearthed some of Pearse's machines, marveling at their design. The New Zealand Museum of Trade and Transport in Auckland has some of them on display today. Bolt also went back to the area where Pearse made his infamous flight into the hedge and interviewed the witnesses to that historic event. Much of Pearse's legacy seems to be tied up in the question of whether he achieved powered flight ahead of the Wright brothers, a question that seems important to some New Zealanders but didn't seem particularly important to Richard Pearse, who argued that his first rough attempts at aviation were simply too rough to qualify, even though he held himself to a particularly high standard. But the question itself is largely academic. He was unknown by his contemporaries. His designs, though advanced, were not seen and so didn't impact the development of aviation. He did secure patents, but they were largely unrecognized and unenforced. But that doesn't mean his innovations were any less impressive. He was a man who had a vision of flying through the air years ahead of his time. Of course, we do that all the time today. It really raises the question of how important his genius might have been if he had simply been inventing somewhere else, or if he'd had the means to secure an education, or if he'd had corporate backers, like many of his contemporaries did. But if it weren't for men of vision like Richard Pearse, who was willing to continue tinkering in his garage despite his neighbor's derision, we might still be tied to the ground because we lack that bit of inspiration, that vision that allowed us to challenge the hedges that surround our life. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.